Well, on behalf of MITAC, the MIT Activities Committee, I want to welcome you to the MIT Metals Talk today. We are thrilled to have this talk. It's the first time MITAC has offered the talk on the Metals Lab. And it's fantastic to have Tara Fadenrecht here today to talk about all the magic and the beauty and the merging of art and science coming together at the Metals Lab. And today, Tara will talk about making the famous MIT mascot, the Beaver, in metal sculpture form, and how that all comes together with lost wax casting. So with that, Tara, if you want to bring us to the MIT Metals Lab.
Sure. So hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today so you can learn more about this dynamic project. I also want to thank the MIT Activities Committee for inviting me to share this work with you. So what I'm going to do is kind of give you a broad overview of where we are at this point with the project. This is the third semester the special subject class is being offered, and also touch upon the lost wax casting process so you can understand a little bit more of the processes that we'll be undertaking once we get to that point, hopefully next semester when we can be on campus together, if not in the following fall. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. Everyone can see that? Okay.
Looks great.
Thank you very much. So just a little background about this particular class. So this class is 3SO6, Casting a Tradition or Casting a New Tradition. I've been at MIT now for 7 years. I'm in the Department of Materials Science and Engineering. And a big part of what we like to do in our department is allow the students to have a hands-on experience with the materials. So this hands-on way of processing, whether it's blacksmithing or casting, or even, characterization, tensile testing, all this good stuff, helps supplement the material that they're learning in their coursework. So this could be anything from 3091, learning about solid state chemistry, crystal structures, and then how, dependent upon those crystal structures, how the material responds to heat and plastic deformation. Or it could be a way too of gaining further understanding of the material through those different processes. And for some, it's a way of de-stressing as well. It's a way to come in from all the P-sets, all of pre-COVID, all of the work that's being done on the computer, and have that physical interaction, lose yourself in the process, and express something that's inside you. So we've been offering classes in the Merton C. Fleming's Materials Processing Lab, also known as the MIT Forge and Foundry. During IAP, we offer, casting, enameling, jewelry, blacksmithing, anything that basically has to do with metalworking from an artistic standpoint. We offer that during IAP. Also have a couple of HASE or art classes that are featuring the same thing, this mix of metallurgy, material science, and then supplementing that art history so that the students can gain some sort of contextualization for what we're looking at, and then supplementing all of that with design and sculptural concepts. The students are able to balance all three of these three different fields coming together. So we've always had great interest in the students coming in, and that's how I met Fufi, who invited me. She participated in one of these hands-on labs, and they're always oversubscribed and very popular. So I was looking to add more opportunities for students to get this hands-on experience. So I came up with this idea called for the special subject class, casting a new tradition, casting a tradition that would fuse all of these things together and at the same time provide a platform for students to work as a collective, coming together to design this sculpture that does highlight MIT's mascot, the beaver, and working collectively on that and seeing how much applied materials science and, for that matter, mechanical engineering goes into creating a large-scale interactive cast sculpture. So that's kind of the impetus behind that, was to offer more opportunities for students that wanted to get in there, wanted to learn about metals, wanted to maybe learn how to express themselves in a different format, and yeah, have an awesome sculpture at the end. So my initial concept was, of course, the beaver, which is a fantastic mascot. This is an animal that serves, can be both on land and water, nature's engineer, and a really hardy, stout rodent to begin to work with. Supplementing that, I wanted to build off this idea of the brass rat or the MIT class ring, how this has become a milestone for the students when they go through the ring ceremony, and you'll see graduates out in the world still sporting their rings. So something that picked up on the same thematic way of being part of a greater collective and again, working with the beaver in a metal format. I also had this idea to have some sort of viewer interactivity with the sculpture, thinking what if the cast sculpture had some sort of skin upon it, that the hair upon the skin would react with a magnetic wand. So similar to what you see, this is kind of one of these pin art things. I was thinking about this and this idea of hair moving along the beaver and how that might involve additional metalsmithing techniques. The students would be able to work with steel a little bit more and just have a little bit more interaction with the viewer that's holding the magnetic wand, so to speak. So of course we start with our research, image collection, all these good things that you see here. If we want this sculpture to be life-size, we need to be aware that we are placing this into a public sphere and make sure that it's accessible and safe for everyone to enjoy the particular sculpture. And also not just looking at the beaver, but also how is the beaver presented? And what I mean with that is how is it placed on the pedestal? We saw recently calls to remove certain sculptures that have that are deemed offensive. And this has been a big part of the dialogue we've been having this semester in my class, is not to just put things out into the world on this elevated pedestal, and that we should always constantly be looking up towards whatever's placed on the pedestal, but really consider, how does this artwork exist in a civic space? Again, it's a beaver, which is less confrontational than humans are, simply, but nonetheless, we want to have as much engagement with the artwork as possible. So that's kind of where the research originated from, and I'll go in a little bit more in depth about specific concerns when it comes to the research. From that, obviously, we've translated some of those parts of the image collection into drawings, renderings, and anything else that's a component of the schematics, translating all of that from 2D to 3D. There are also certain specific concerns because we will be working with a life-size sculpture. When it comes to casting, we would want to cast that hollow and with multiple components that will later be welded together. So it's one thing to come up with the overall design, which is the main focus, obviously, but how do we break that down so that it can actually be manageable for our particular facility at MIT, and how do we kind of hide these seams and the mechanical attachments so that when the viewer views this, it all blends in like magic. Of course, prototyping and sample making are a next extension of the research and the schematics. And I have some examples that I'll show you. And then eventually we have finally decided upon a model for the Beaver, the position, and how we want it to be posed, the back, other sculptural components of the collective piece, and translating that again to a maquette that can later be scaled up, which is what we see here. So eventually, once we're back on campus, the goal is to translate all those schematics that we've been working on, both in CAD and physical models, into something at scale. This would involve armature construction that will support the clay that's placed on top of the armature to translate that small maquette. I think it's at a 1/6 scale to life size. And part of lost wax casting is traditionally you would make molds of your clay that can be silicone rubber molds, I should clarify, that you would pour liquid wax into, and then those wax pieces would be what you are lost wax casting. So again, relating this these two are parallel with one another in their importance for where the joints will align. So traditionally, when you are translating a model to a large, to scale, you need some sort of armature that exists underneath the clay. Otherwise, the clay will collapse upon itself, and then you won't be able to make those rubber molds. So through the armature construction and mold making, we see a couple additional materials coming into play. So we are, of course, working with wax and refractory material, which I will explain next. But we're also seeing silicone rubber coming into play. Armature construction will most likely be out of a mild steel. So students will learn about steel, learn about the TIG welding process. And continuing along that line is, of course, the fabrication, the welding, and any potential machining that needs to be done afterwards, using the mill or the lathe to true up any shapes or to work on mechanical attachments for the particular parts or the sculpture to the, let's say, the pedestal or to the place that it will eventually be installed. These are all considerations that the students are working on. And now after the piece is cast and put together and welded, then the real process of metal finishing, of elevating that hunk of metal into an art form really starts to take place. And this is anything from, working with a very aggressive grinding wheel and then switching progressively towards finer and finer grit, sandpaper, polishing, and getting to the point where we can think about adding a patina. So patina is a layer of surface oxidation. This can be either thermally or chemically induced. So something like these are some student samples from last fall, working on foliage that is native to New England that we might want to consider as litter around the beaver sculpture. So what you see here are some hand-formed chased copper pieces, and then they have a couple different colors of patina. Here we have an iron hydroxide that's been painted onto the surface, and on the surface of this thinner leaf we have copper compounds that are placed on the surface there. So the students again will learn about the surface chemistries and or surface oxidations and the chemistry behind that. I should mention that our cast sculpture will not be in pure copper. It will be in a bronze alloy. So any of these patinas will react with the copper that's contained within that alloy. So as we continue down the path of creating this collective sculpture, I always like the students to remember to allow for the unknown. And what I mean by that is that although you may, for instance, be trying to achieve a particular patina for, say, this leaf here, it's great to do your research, follow along, and follow the protocol or the recipe, so to speak, for the patina. But sometimes things happen in front of our eyes during the process that maybe we don't we weren't necessarily planning for, but nonetheless attract us, and we respond to those things. And although it may not be applicable for the particular piece or the particular process that we're looking for, maybe it's not the end result that we want, I like to remind the students to keep their eyes open, because maybe they'll want to store that away for another day and use it for a different project. It's just about being aware and responding to the material as it's in your hands. I think that that's a very powerful thing, again, to really start to understand the material a little bit more in depth through the hands-on process. So I thought I'd go through the lost wax casting process by showing you these components for the Quarter Century Club door knocker, which is a recognition gift that I've been working on with the Quarter Century Club. So when you work with wax, ancient people originally started working with beeswax. Here what you see is something called a sprue wax with a little bit of victory wax. You can also use paraffin. And you would want to pick the particular type of wax for its material properties. So this red wax here is fairly rigid. It's a microcrystalline wax. It will hold a tool mark. So you can see I've put in some little hair texture here. There's some indentations for the whiskers. So it's going to hold all those carvings, those reductive processes really well. But for certain things where I need a little bit more malleability, I would use this kind of brown wax you see here coming into play. That's very pliable, very plastic. And to be honest, when I first created this, the beaver head at least, it was created completely out of the brown wax. And then, as I mentioned, I made a silicone rubber mold of that. And then I can just continue to pull multiples of waxes with the liquid wax poured into that. So all these waxes are compatible, and you can translate a lot of carving techniques to the harder waxes, or a lot of ceramic techniques to the more pliable wax. So really it's, endless what you can do with it. The material is extremely plastic and allows for a lot of creativity. So these would be the separate components for the door knocker. This is kind of inverted, that kind of hangs down below. And what you see here with this vertical piece of wax and the pouring cup here, and these kind of little small linear pieces, this is what we call the sprue. And these smaller ones are called the gate. And what they do is essentially provide the plumbing for the molten metal to be delivered once it's inside the mold. So it's not nothing, the orientation of these gates and sprues, because we want to have we want the least amount of turbulence as the molten metal is being poured into the refractory mold. We obviously want to deliver the metal to all of these thin parts. They're going to need additional routes. So you can see there's a supplementary gate attached here. All of these components coming together to help us achieve the successful casting on the end. So gating and spruing is extremely important. It doesn't matter how fantastic your wax is if you can't get the metal delivered to that part of the mold. The particular type of refractory material that we work with is a mix of silica, so sand, plaster, and fiberglass. When I talk about a refractory material, it's anything that's insulating, that's going to withstand both the temperature of the molten metal being poured into the mold. We usually pour silicon bronze around 1100 degrees Celsius, and it also needs to withstand the pressure of that displaced air that's in the mold and then being displaced as the molten metal is poured in there. And of course, we want to keep it insulating, and that's why silica is so great about that, so that as the metal starts to solidify, it's kept protected and it can solidify at a gradual, progressive rate without too much shock to the material inside. So once you have your waxes sprued and gated, this is a vertical overshot. you need some sort of mold container that your ceramic slurry can be poured into. What you'll see here is that on the top of some of these, what you can see here is that they have a skim coating of the ceramic slurry. This helps pick up all of those details, all the hair, the intimate or the small parts of the nose, what have you. This type of investment mold, the fidelity is so extremely high that not only will it pick up all those little details, it will also pick up your fingerprint if that exists on the wax. So we like to put a thin coat, a skim coat of this over the surface to really make sure we get into all those cavities that have been carved, and also to prevent any sort of air bubbles along the surface of the wax. Anything that is a positive within the mold or is a negative within the mold, so a air bubble will end up being a positive on the other side in the metal. So here's kind of the process of what you would do next. Pouring along the side of the wax model, not directly above it. That slurry solidifies in about 20 minutes. And you can see at this point, the paper tubing has been removed. We can see the bottom of the pouring cup that we saw on the other piece. And then it goes into the furnace. And this is where we get the lost wax cast name from, is that as it's heated for 3 hours at 350, the wax is evacuated out through the bottom, and it's collected in a pan here, and that pan is removed, obviously, so we don't have a smoke fest inside the foundry. And then we're going to go ahead and pump the temperature up and make sure that that ceramic is nice and solidified, that it can withstand all of the pressures and the temperature change as well. What we like to do for the least amount of thermal shock, once that 1100 degree Celsius metal is being poured in there, is to keep the molds at an elevated temperature. Then there's less shock as that molten metal is being poured into the mold. So we usually keep those at a little bit higher. That also helps with thinner areas. If there's less shock to the metal as it comes into contact with something cold, it tends to want to freeze and seize on you. You can alleviate that by keeping the metal hot, and you're more likely to get into those thinner areas due to less of a temperature gap between the ceramic material and the metal. Then you would heat up your silicon bronze. You want to pour that into the molds. The molds are allowed to solidify, again, depending on the size. For what we're looking at, it's about 20 minutes. You want to just let the metal completely solidify before you break it open. Here you can see that how strong the refractory material needs to be as that metal goes in there and expands. And this is just a fissure that's luckily the mold didn't completely crack open, but just how much pressure that ceramic undertakes and how very vital that ceramic is. And I can't believe I'm a metals person saying such great things about ceramics. No, it all comes together and is utilized for the right purpose. So I just wanted to show kind of the fun part of working with these molds. These are called waste molds, meaning they can only be used one time. This is kind of the maybe not so great thing about lost wax casting, is that the process takes, from the spruing all the way to where these students are destroying their molds, about 24 hours. And then knowing that you're only going to be able to use that mold one time is something to consider. But when you're going for details, this is the way you have to go. And it is simply a one-time only mold. So once the investment molds are broken, you still have the fun work of removing the metal components from the sprues and then starting that finishing process that I mentioned, starting with coarser grit tools and then progressively working finer and finer. And then combining polishing, patina, sandblasting, you end up with a finished piece. This is the Quarter Century Club door knocker that I make. So it is a long process. And each step obviously matters because it directly impacts the next step that's following. You want to make sure your wax is as perfect as possible before you invest it. It's more often than not, it's a lot easier to remove wax than it is to remove metal. So that's kind of the overview of the lost wax casting process. Part of this class is, as I mentioned, making sure that students are aware of where these artworks that they're responding to, where they're from, and where as a collective group, where we slot into the timeline of human creation, especially as it comes, I'm sorry, not human creation, but the creation of art by humans. So what I like to do with the students, I have students from many different backgrounds. Some have had previous experience with visual arts, some have never taken a class. So before we jump into designing this collective sculpture, we look at sculpture from a sculpture standpoint. We look at it from concerns of mass, volume, line, texture, and the students began the semester by working with something more malleable, more forgiving than metal is. So clay, as you can see here in this particular sample, there's a natural segue from working from clay to wax. You're working with masses. A lot of it is the reductive process. You're paying attention to the surface texture quite a bit. Students also learn about metals through plastic deformation, so forming copper sheet. And learning about annealing and the way metal is going to behave each time you hammer it. There's an immediate response throughout the material. So I've included some examples of students that have been working with copper sheet. So we start with clay and paper and then transition to sheet metal, fabrication, and eventually lost wax when we're on campus. And then again, Patina coming into work after that. So we have the students also be able to discuss their decisions. Why did they make this particular choice? What processes were involved? What would they change in the future? And again, to build their confidence in talking about sculpture, and it's a valuable part. One thing to be able to talk about your own work, but also to be able to look at someone else's work, critique it, and communicate. Effectively communicate. So the crit component is also valuable to the students' overall understanding of the material for the class. And just some more fun with patina, looking at surface textures here. It was a great group. All the groups that I've had for this class have been amazing and really dug in. So once they have, considered these things for form, and we're also working abstract, and then this is more based on representational imagery, then we started to really dig into what we want the beaver sculpture to look like. So again, last fall, we were able to take a lot of great field trips. We went to the Natural History Museum. Students were able to draw from the taxidermied beavers and other creatures inside the museum. We also were able to visit the Gray House, and Mrs. Rife and Erica were great about letting the students investigate pre-existing sculptures, so other sculptures that other artists have been commissioned for by MIT to make, featuring the lovely mascot, the beaver. This is another sculpture that's outside, Garden Tim. So they get to interact with these sculptures, see how they're installed, and that's a valuable part of it. And then they get to see the way in which other artists have interpreted the same subject matter. So part of this was thinking about what type of symbolism do we as a group want to present about MIT. So one of the first ideas we thought about was the thinker, or the plotting beaver. This is, the idea about learning through observation, building, using critical analysis to really fix the problems at hand, and, thinking, pondering, immersing yourself in the problem and in the solution in that same way. And looking at how other artists, such as Rodin, have represented this idea of quiet contemplation. And again, I know this is a beaver, but nonetheless, these are some of the considerations that we were thinking about and still thinking about. At the other time, we looked at uh, kind of the flip side of being at MIT, which is the diving beaver, diving head first to tackle problems, being extremely forward moving. And building off that pre-existing work and knowledge, but really just going after the problem and problem solving together. This is also a very dynamic pose and shows that duality of the beaver, right? That it can, in many ways, it's very dynamic underwater, and we don't necessarily think about that because we're not always privy to being in that particular environment. But I like this idea of the active pose coming into play and the work that's still being done. So the students made maquettes. We voted on the particular orientation of the beaver, and we ended up with the diving beaver. So this is a maquette of kind of the position of the beaver. There are certain things that we need to resolve. You can see that the pedestal is a bit stunted on the back. But overall, what we're looking at here is the position and how do we want to create that nice, beautiful curve of the beaver maneuvering inside these reeds and taking this stick to continue the work at hand. So as we moved from, that was kind of where we ended up last fall, and as we transitioned towards spring, the disruption happened naturally, but we didn't want to let the momentum stop. So some students were tasked with figuring out this idea of the hair, the movable hair. How can that still be attached to the cast structure of the beaver, but allow movement of steel hair to respond to the magnetic wand? So students worked on a couple different type of chainmail patterns. Here we see more traditional European chainmail patterns, and then have these beautiful examples of Japanese 6-2 on the left-hand side patterns as well. And then, of course, this was done remotely, and sculpture in general, we want to physically interact with the material, right? We have that third dimension that we can engage with. So we continued with some of these chainmail patterns over the summer, and I'll show those next. In addition, students were tasked with researching magnetic alloys, different types of magnets, structural steels that we'd want to use for the supports, the hair that actually moves back and forth, and a little bit more about the pedestal, how resolved or how traditional we want the pedestal to be. Do we want it to be elevated? And work continues on that this semester. Over the summer, I had a couple Europs that were great to work with, and they continued some of the work that we originated in the spring, one of which was translating the 6-2 chainmail pattern, which is normally a flat sheet. How will that end up conforming to an organic shape, an irregular shape? So some of these things that we'd have to think about are size gradients going from a smaller ring, say towards the front of the face, and then a gradient outwards, and then how many steps we want in between that. So Spencer, who worked on getting some of those figures figured out for us, and also compiling data about where we could source materials, and all good things related to chainmail. He also translated the base of the pedestal via SolidWorks into an STL file that students can pick up with this semester and continue to resolve that pedestal, for instance. So translating again from the physical object and having the students work on it remotely in a way that students that are able to CAD files or are interested in working with CAD can take that pre-existing file and experiment with it and add to it as we progress. Additionally, we needed to translate that wax beaver into cat as well. So this is another year up, Sam Ferguson, and I just wanted to include some of his images on how he translated, kind of the step-by-step process of going from the wax rounded curvilinear form, and then kind of created facets from it, and then simply expanded those facets to continue to curve the shape to the beaver that you see here. So from this semester's students are working on figuring out or refining some of the features that are at this point either missing from the particular file, or the digital file, or just weren't, we need a little bit more resolution, such as the front part or the front feet of the beaver need that, the claws, the webbing, the padding, that needs to be a little bit more defined. Students are also working on the eyeball, which involves, of course, the eyeball, but more importantly, the eyebrow, the eyelids, because that kind of sets the overall features for the face. And as we're, talking about creating an active pose for the beaver, we want that to be, we want to see that same response in the facial features. So that's kind of where that is. And additionally, as we continue to resolve the sculpture, we need to figure out how to cast it into those small pieces. And remember, I mentioned at the beginning, we want to cast this hollow. So this is Sam, again, working with breaking the beaver sculpture down into castable sections. And you can see there's this kind of truncated cone here on this side. Here he's trying to figure out the placement of the sprue and the gating, the plumbing system that I talked about earlier, to make sure that we get the components that we want and that there isn't too much warpage, or that we'll be able to put all the pieces back together again to get that beaver. So he started this, he did, how to translate the wax to the CAD file. And we started to translate this particular piece into a program called Procast. So this is a section of the back leg of the beaver, right above, I guess, the ankle. And another year off, starting the semester, Sergio Arenas is working with Procast. So Procast can tell you many different things. It can model how the metal will actually be, poured into the component that you want. You can also see how the heat is being transferred as it solidifies. And all of this solidification knowledge will also tell us about if there's any sort of porosity, meaning that some of the gases get absorbed into the metal as it's liquid and then it solidifies, they become porous. And you can see on this particular GIF, say for instance, we're looking at this front gate here, you can see that the flow becomes stunted, right? It kind of drops off and then pours again. So before we go to all the work of gating, screwing, investing, casting, and then we, realize that the cast component is porous as we start to remove the surface, and we have tiny little pores in it. We save ourselves time by running it through Procast, and figuring all of the geometries out, for the gating and screwing ahead of time. So we save headaches and materials, and more importantly, time down the road. So it's a fantastic program for the students to, have a visualization of what would happen within the world based on the parameters that you set up for the casting. So that would include the alloy. You can see up here, there's how much time you're pouring, and what's the refractory mold as well, how hot is the mold. So a way to visualize that before you actually go to physically do that in the real world. finally, I just want to say that this process and this class is really about allowing students to have the hands-on experience, to be creative, maybe discover they have a talent that they didn't know about, or build upon pre-existing skill sets that they may have from wood shop or a machine shop. But it's really about us coming together and creating something together. And my job is to provide the information for the students, to encourage them, to guide and kind of make sure that we're all staying on the same track together. But it's really not my sculpture. It's really the student's sculpture. And that's very important for me, that it's theirs to own. It's theirs to be part of. And so, of course, the students are contributing to different components of the sculpture, the chainmail, the eyes, what have you. Additionally, I encourage each one of them to create a signature wax. So these are waxes that will be rubber molded and then cast into metal and will be somewhere within the pedestal, so that when they come back to visit as alumni, that they can find their maker's mark and see their name amongst all the other people that participated in this awesome sculpture and brought it into fruition. So I just have a couple images of the crews so far. I didn't grab a snapshot yet of fall 2020, but they're there, no doubt. And I just want to, sorry, is my internet? I just wanted to say this is made possible by the alumni class funds from MIT that supported this proposal for this special project classes. And the Europe office has been fantastic. And of course, my home base, TMSE, for the use of facilities. There's a great crew down in the Forge and Foundry. And once we open back up, I invite you to come downstairs to 4006. We're right across the hall from the showy glass lab. It'll be where all the sound is coming from. And come down and see the students working and see the dynamic instructors that are there to help stoke the fires, both in the forges and also within the students as well. We also do have an Instagram page, or Instagram. You can see how down I am with this, but we also have an Instagram account that shows more of the students' work and goes more in depth about the process. And with that, I want to thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much for the talk. That was really entertaining. And thank you everybody for switching over to the new meeting with us. I'm sorry for that inconvenience again. If anybody has any questions, if you want to, feel free to unmute your mic and you can ask Tara directly, or if you would not like to, you can also drop it in chat for us and we'll read it out for you. So what has it been like trying to teach students from a distance in a practical sense?
Yeah, it's not the best, but it's not the best for any of us, right? We're just trying to keep the students active and keep them, all the things that I've been saying. They each received a maker's box this semester, which is a little bit different than last semester. So they've been creating works since the beginning of the semester out of, as I mentioned, paper and styrofoam that can later be translated into metal or eventually cast. But it has been difficult to, those moments that you take for granted when you're in a lab or a studio that you see, students are interacting with each other. Oh, what process are you working on? How did you get that effect? And from an instructor standpoint, there's a lot of little tips that I can help the student with in the moment. If I see, for instance, they're holding the saw blade incorrectly, I can come over and show them a better way to do that. And although we're providing videos for the students, for them to view how to, utilize certain tools or different techniques, it's those little moments that personally I miss, those smaller interactions. But, they're MIT students. they're trucking along. And I think as long as you are excited about it and you are passionate about it, that translates to the students. So they've been motivated, and we know we're not where we want to be exactly, but we're trying to get there. So it's been good. It's been good.
Has it been like a more design heavy kind of time for you? Have they been like churning out different projects that once you're able to get back in the forge, they'll just be popping off left and right?
This will have a whole Etsy store in there right away. Yeah, so most of it has been, either using SolidWorks, or some of them are doing more research based on installation concerns, such as text. How do we want our signage to appear? And formatting, tone, the style, the material. And while that's not like this, the sexiest thing to be researching, it does have an impact on the way that the sculpture is, not only the way it's presented, but also the way in which it's interpreted by the audience. So it's extremely valuable for the students. Also, when you think about just presentation in general, how do we get this message across? That what is it all about? How do we succinctly do that? So there's projects like that where they're working with individuals at the MIT Museum that we reach out to them, and I think that helps expand the project. The students get a different perspective than hearing my voice all the time, and they get to hear from professionals in that field that have been dealing with these particular concerns, such as tone and legibility, readability. And this all is, under the umbrella of what we need to know. We have the data then at that point. And then once we're back on campus and things are, we're able to progress with the actual physical casting of the sculpture, we have all of this other research done. And so we're not waiting on the next step necessarily. It'll just come in at a later time.
If anybody has any other questions. Diane, I see you've unmuted.
Tara, I just have a question, just basically about the history of the metals lab, kind of how it all came to be. I mean, it's a spectacular, magical place as the glass lab is. But if you can just share a little bit of the history of the metals lab.
Yeah, definitely. So mining and metallurgy were the basis for course 3, for material science and engineering. So blacksmithing obviously was an obvious way for students that were studying back in the late 1800s to, that was, you had to experience the steel to understand a little bit more about the metallurgy that the field you're going into. So blacksmithing has been part of MIT, like I said, since the late 1800s. It kind of died off until around the mid 80s. And that was brought back by Professor Sam Allen. He's a retired professor now for material science and engineering, but he saw the importance of blacksmithing again to kind of complement and bring closure to the students' understanding of a material. So since the 80s, that's been a vital component of DMSE. The foundry has always been kind of there as well, not since the late 1800s, but it's another way of looking at how to process materials. And that's really what the Merton C. Fleming's Materials Processing Lab is really about. We're utilizing metals predominantly on the forge and foundry side, but working with different heat sources, different quenching techniques, whatever the end result that you want to get back or you want to get to, there's a way we can trace it back and figure out those processes within the lab. So although we're utilizing ceramics, polymers in the lab, we are predominantly a metals lab, and we do everything from small intricate casting, cast rings. The brass rats are always popular to actually have those cast in brass, all the way to large components for steam engines and whatnot. So it's a fantastic place. It is a magical place, I guess you could say. It is a place that you can kind of get out of the hustle and bustle, the hive of MIT, and really immerse yourself in the process. And I think a lot of that has to do with the very physical nature of the materials, whether you are blacksmithing, which is, you know, physical, demanding, but you can see that it's also about honing in and really putting your intention into each one of those steps of, say, for instance, the casting process, and losing yourself in those steps, which I think is valuable nowadays as we continue to progress even more so into the digital realm, and having a digital interface between us and what we're working on. We still live in a very material world. Ceramics, metals, they still form, polymers and glass, obviously, they still form a lot of our environment. So the more you know about those materials, whether it's from, you know, characterization or material properties, or simply you know more about the process behind how they're created, that's really where we come in and supplement the students' understanding of the materials. So that was a very roundabout answer to say, yes, I agree, it's a magical place. I should mention that we have a great team in there as well. So Mike Tarkanian is our lab director. We have fantastic technical instructors, James Hunter, who will be talking about blacksmithing, I think, in a couple weeks, Seamus Hudson, and Chris DePerna. So we have a great team in there, and we all have our own little specialties. But all in all, we're metalheads, and that's really what we're there for, to share that love and that passion and understanding of the material with the students.
Thank you so much, Tara. And it always amazes me that, you know, MIT has such amazing, you know, all kinds of niches around campus that are this beautiful merge of science and art and technology. This incredible, you know, art going on in a way you may not even think about. So, and the metals lab, you know, along with the glass lab and many others, you know, just a few of those beautiful, magical places. So yeah, thank you.
You're welcome.
And if anybody has any last minute questions, feel free to speak out or drop them in chat. But if not, thank you again so much for this talk. This was wonderful. And I do want to remind people, like you mentioned, we will be hosting another MIT Metals Lab talk. At the moment, the plan is January 12th. We're still hammering out the details. So keep an eye on our our newsletters for news of that part 2 Metals Lab talk. And thank you to everybody for coming out and joining us for the talk. It's great to see so many people really excited about the work the lab is doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Thank you.
Tara, so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.